All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Quick Tip 100. 100. All right, I was gonna edit that sound to be more grand, but never mind. Let's just get the quick tip out there because it's been like 4 months, and I apologize. Maybe it's not been 4 months. I don't remember. But anyway, Quick Tip 100. Welcome. The miniature you see before you is the first miniature I'd painted and actually painted with the intent of using it in a competition. From this point back, almost everything I've entered into competition has been a gaming piece, and I think I've only ever painted one piece for an actual competition, and it turned out to win a best in category for Resin Beasts. So I figured, why not give myself another shot at this whole actually painting specifically for a competition. More on that some other time. But anyway, today we're going to talk about how I built the plinth and how I designed it, which in all honesty was just a kind of spark of inspiration and evolved as it went. So if you don't mind joining me, we will get into it right now with some video. Alright, so first and foremost, you got to kind of pick out your plinth, and obviously you should have your miniature built and ready to kind of stage. I've already started working on the mini, so I kind of know I want to use this plinth from Jacob Jansen. It's a beautiful piece of wood, but I kind of had this idea of a ruined type of atmosphere, obviously 40k. So one of the first rules I always try to follow when I'm building up a scenic plinth is that the plinth should not be the boundaries. There should be no magical lines that extend from the sides of this plinth that say you cannot build past this point. So I've got some extruded XPS foam here that I actually cut down on my wire foam heat cutter thingy. I've also got some old brass etched terrain bits from Games Workshop back in the day. G-Dub, please start making these again. But I'm essentially roughing out some of these pieces. I'm going to be making different pieces of rubble and floor, and I'm just cutting off the little sprue tabs here, which it's stamped and etched, so whatever. But go ahead and model it down to your standards. I'm going to get rid of these nubs because I don't want them to be part of my display, right? So just sanding it down here a little bit. Super glue on some XPF foam. This is Beast Bond by Creature Casters, one of my favorite regular old super glues. Do keep in mind this will melt extruded foam, and I'm just going to kind of spread it out so it's not nearly as thick so it won't eat through the foam. It'll dry quicker than it will eat through the foam. So I'm just using a little micro applicator here so that when I'm ready to stick it to the corner of the foam, it will dry quicker than melt. And of course, here it is. Nothing fancy yet, right? Ooh, big deal, Duff. Well, I'm going to go through and I'm going to show you guys some really cool little tips and whatnot within this build. This being a 1/2 inch piece of foam, I cut it down to about an 1/8 inch, and I'm just using the plinth to kind of help keep it in place for about 3-4 minutes while it dries. And now that it's dry, terrible cropping here. I apologize there, I moved it up. I'm using a brand new sharp blade. I know it looks rusty, but it's just from a chemical that I accidentally used to scrape off. But I'm squaring up my corners because the idea is this is a tile that broke off of the floor of the rubble that we're going to build, and it'll make more sense later. But notice I didn't cut across the rough face. I'm going to go ahead and just break this XPF foam. I can't quite break it perfectly, so I'm kind of scoring a very, very light line to give it a little bit of encouragement to break. And you can see here, I just kind of pull it off. I'm not super happy with it. The reason I'm not using cork is too grainy. I want this to be more deliberate, right? So I'm using the very tip of the X-Acto knife here, and I'm just picking out those indentations right along the crack line of the tile. It's meant to be rough. It's not really deliberate. I want it to be more random than noticeable. Okay. So once you've got that all set, you can use it to stage on your piece and kind of start getting your idea. Now, I wish I had sketched out my plan, but I had a general idea of what I wanted in this piece, but it evolved drastically from the start. Don't forget, when you're using a beautiful piece of wood like this for a plinth, you're going to want to mask off the surface, the show surface. So this side and all the way around, you'll see it'll jump ahead here in a minute, and the whole plinth will be masked off. Make sure, if you're worried about any paint or any texture paste or anything getting on your plinth, mask it off. It is so hard to remove it off the plinth, and then you got to use chemicals. You're going to just destroy the finish of this beautiful piece of wood. So I've got it masked off. Now I'm going to start laying the base. This will not be the predominant, I guess, texture, if you will, on the plinth itself, but it's going to be the basis, literally the basis. The base is going to be the base. It's going to be the basis of everything to come, right? So this is AK Muddy Terrain. Here's my plug for my own store. Yes, I sell it in my store. I use a ton of this stuff on all my bases, everything. It's a great start, right? It's good enough it can be used on its own, but by the time this plinth is done, you will not be able to see 85% of what I'm putting down here. And this plinth is slightly tapered to the front side, meaning it's probably at about a 5-degree angle, shorter in the front, taller in the back. And for what I'm doing, I don't really want that, so I'm actually using this tongue depressor to kind of smooth things out and level it off, because eventually what I'm going to have down here is a platform or a piece of broken off flooring in some Gothic ruins that a Space Marine is leaping off of, right? So this is just me kind of forming the paste, and I don't like the texture to be too uniform, so I might use the flat edge of the tongue depressor to kind of give it a little bit more texture or whatever, and I'm just building up that front edge a little bit here, kind of leveling it off. This stuff takes a while to cure, so I would recommend, at minimum, letting this stuff dry for about 24 hours. This build took me about 3 or 4 days just because I was letting things dry. So again, I'm smoothing it off to the face of the plinth. Now, I did mention, hey, you don't have to stop right at the plinth lines. That comes in when I start laying out my rubble and stuff. For this, it wouldn't make any sense for my mud to kind of be off the plinth. So I'm tidying up the edges and just kind of creating a more realistic muddy texture. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. And that's just squaring up the edges there. That's all I'm doing. So now that I've got it kind of where I want, I've got this polystyrene tubing. You can get this at any scale model shop, but essentially this is just, it's plastic tube, right? And I'm going to bury it underneath that texture. I've furled up the I guess the front portion of the pipe itself, kind of gnarled it up. You can see on my thumb there, like it's a busted pipe, right? One of the things I wish I would have done here was kind of model in a little bit of sludge coming out of it, but that's a story for a different time. But essentially, model it down into the paste until you get it to where you want. This stuff is phenomenal because it can melt and cut so simply. You can see there it is. That's what I ended up kind of going with. Now here's kind of where the plinth begins to kind of change direction. I was originally going to use just this one little piece of flooring and have that edge out there, but you'll see here in a minute it ends up in a completely different spot because I really don't like how I created all that great texture and now I'm just burying it in the mud here. So I'll switch it over and I'm kind of like, no, I don't like this. I want it to be off the plinth more. The idea is that the eye is going to be drawn to the subject matter, and that'll make more sense in a few minutes here. But you can see I used that broken edge to be kind of projected out. It's also slightly tapered, so the left side, the one that's now facing my right, is actually higher than the straight portion that's in the middle of the plinth. And now I'm just trying to convince the viewer that, okay, this has been here for a moment. It's kind of buried in the gunk and the debris, whatever, the mud. So I'm kind of backfilling also so that it doesn't move, it doesn't go up or down. It doesn't sink as it dries. This is all while that mud texture is still wet. Everything on the plinth is wet. I'm burying it and trying to get edges covered so it looks more natural. That's the biggest part, is making sure things look natural. So what I've done here, I've taken a piece of like mesh, I don't know what to call it, but I kind of bent it, made it all gross and, just like completely warped. And I took a little bit of the basing paste, the terrain mud here, and added some water so that it would be a little more fluid, so that it would fill in the mesh and kind of act as a glue. This stuff will harden enough that it's going to hold that mesh in place. And that's what I'm doing right now, is I'm just adding in more texture paste. Because at the end of the plinth build, most of this mesh is going to be covered. But the idea is that I wanted to kind of bury it instead of relying on glue itself. Most of this is going to be covered up. But again, you see, I'm building off of the plinth, but not so much that it's distracting, okay? So that's what we kind of end up with. It actually changes a little bit more throughout the process. Now I've got an old piece of G-dub ruined wall. It's like a really small piece. And I've sunken in some really small brass rod. The reason I did that is not only for stability, but I want it to stay in that spot. I'm traveling on a plane with this plinth. It's an artistic piece, right? So I really want to make sure that those frail pieces are going to be more stable in transport. And of course, just standard operating procedure, glue the posts in. I slather up these posts pretty good because we're not done with any of this. We're not even remotely close. Slide it down in there, make sure it's as flush as possible before we move on to the next step. And there you go. You can start to see the scene kind of taking shape here. By the way, at this point, the mud is dry. So this is a bit of guitar string. I have all kinds of cool little things that you would never think to use, but guitar string, especially the fatter strings, are wound steel around wire, essentially. So what I'm doing here is kind of exposing the underwire by a couple of wraps, and I'm just going to cut off the outer wrap, and that's going to look just like some sort of insulated wire. I know, crappy video here, I apologize, but that's going to look like exposed wire with that tiny little bit sticking out, and that's going to be great to use in a bundle of wires. So there's kind of your idea. I actually pivot from this. I took two insulated real wires and kind of like twisted them up together. I wanted varying textures. I end up using a smaller guitar string, that one you just saw, and just a single piece of normal wire. But the idea is that I'm trying to change up the texture in the wire bundle, because if I did 3 guitar strings, it just would be too mundane, right? So you want to add in some variance. So this is a part from, I think, a night. And I just cut off this tube that's already got texture. And really, there's no reason I'm altering this other than I just want more texture, more organics, if you will. So I'm going to take on the flat part and be careful. I'm not very careful with this stuff, but I'm kind of giving myself a score in the center where I'm going to drill out a hole for those 3 little wires, if you will, the 2 guitar strings and the real wire. And I'm just going to drill it far enough that I can slip those in there and glue them in. Nothing too fancy. It can be done with a pin vise. Before I actually shove them in there, I'm going to glue them all together. Obviously, it doesn't fit right now, so I'm going to end up going to my X-Acto knife to kind of open up that bore, if you will. All I'm doing is sticking that blade in there and just twisting it a little bit, and that's going to give me a slight taper. So when I fit those 3 wires in there, they'll be tight. And here I'm just going to glue the end that I'm going to shove into that wiring. I'm just going to give it a tiny little bit of glue, and I'm going to clean up any excess because I don't want to make the circumference of this bundle bigger than the hole I just drilled. So you see I pivoted to the single wire here, and I'm just gluing it to those 2 guitar strings. And again, the guitar strings are 2 different sizes. Takes a little trickery, but we get it eventually. So I didn't record this part. I forgot to record a lot of things, but I eventually end up cramming that little tri-bundle into the main bundle, and here I am affixing the now created fancy, more detailed wire onto the base. And that's just a little bit of accelerator to kind of help the super glue kick, because I'm impatient and I want to get things done. I went ahead and made myself the main floor, and the idea at this point, you can see the scarabs off under my hand there. I wanted to create some sort of pocket or cave where I'm kind of building up the rubble, but there's a little cave underneath the Space Marine. It's not really a cave as a open pocket, if you will. That's where I put the scarab, and that kind of developed over the course of building this plinth. So again, super glue and extruded foam, not the best of friends, but you can see I've coated this piece in a texture of some sort. Actually, all of the floor pieces that I've created are now coated in a very, very thin layer of AK concrete texture, which again, I sell in my store, impendingduff.com. And I'm just getting ready to kind of place the jumping or diving board, if you will. The idea was it's a leaping assault intercessor. So I wanted to be like heroically jumping off of this flooring and into battle, right? But little does he know there's more whatever lurking beneath him. You know, your job is to tell the story, right? With your scenery and your piece. Well, the piece kind of already starts to dictate the story. So you can see that the front of the floor, being that it's thin foam, is kind of soft. All I'm going to do here is find a way to shore up that edge so it doesn't break. See how flexible it is there? All it is foam and brass. So I'm going to start gluing in spots to kind of firm it up and lock it in. I'm just going to cram some glue in there. I guess I'm going to cram some more in there. And then eventually I'll reach in for different textures and backfill, which, again, I didn't end up filming, mainly because my video card got full, but the base is pretty much done at this point. Now all I've got to do is go out in my backyard, grab a bunch of varying sizes of dirt, rocks, etc., and fill in the cracks and put a bunch of basically varying sizes of debris and rocks and whatnot to kind of make it look natural. So here you see I'm using, this is railroad ballast from a scale store. You can get this anywhere. I'm sure you can get it on Amazon. It's super cheap, and it is really good for like medium-sized rocks in the scene. So I always put my biggest debris down first and kind of cascade down to the smaller stuff. So I'll start with rocks, then I'll go with dirt, like chunky dirt from out back. Then I'll go with fine sand, and in some extreme cases, I'll even use like baby powder, because if you think about it at scale, baby powder would be sand in that scale. But essentially, I'm just kind of building up the rocks here, and you can see that that ledge is kind of much stronger at this point, right? So you don't need to see me kind of putting rocks and everything around, but I will show you a picture at the end here where you can kind of see how the plinth ends up looking. And essentially the goal here was to kind of draw the eye towards the center, if you will. The marine already kind of leans off to the right side of the plinth, the side with my big tattoo. I wanted to kind of keep the plinth from distracting from people, but also build to the story. So the way the plinth flows, it's kind of pulling your eye into the center. So I'm looking at these last pictures, you can kind of see where I added in sand in the cracks and up against the wall, and kind of used the sand and the dirt and different rocks and pebbles and whatnot to essentially blend everything together. You no longer can see where the floor ends and meets the wall. It's kind of homogeneous, if you will, right? I also kind of put a couple of smaller pebbles in the mesh just because I figured it's a fence. I'm sure it'll be holding on to things like that. But your kind of imagination is the limit, if you will. Now, here's a picture of the finished product, and what I want y'all to kind of understand here is that when you're building these plinths up, you don't want it to be so distracting that you can't see the entirety of the miniature. The miniature, again, should be the player. So this isn't about painting it so much, but the flow of the miniature kind of counteracts the flow of the plinth, right? So everything's kind of slightly raised up towards the right side of the plinth, and he's kind of leaping off of it. That idea behind that is that even though there's terrain in the background and you can see it, he's still the main focus. And you can use just about anything you want on these plinths to create these scenes. One thing I tend to shy away from is using cork. Cork just, you can always tell it's cork, so don't be afraid to use textures if you're using cork, which I shouldn't say don't use cork, I should say don't use bare cork. If you use cork, put texture powder or texture paste over it, use your muddy terrain, use your concrete, use your wet jungle, whatever. But build up those plinths, get your miniatures to kind of tell the story, but use the environment around it as well. And by the way, this piece ended up taking the highest silver at Gen Con for the open division. I was 1 point off from getting gold. It still kind of sucks. I'm not going to lie to you guys, I am a little bummed about it, but being that I was the highest ranked silver and there was only 1 gold, I still feel kind of good about it. Anyway, that's Quick Tip 100. And let me know if you enjoyed this one, if you want to see more stuff like this. I did not film any painting of it, but we could talk about my process and my choices in a future video if you'd like. Thanks so much for being patient with me throughout all the terrible internet at the new house. I'm going to try my darndest to crank out more stuff for you guys. I really do appreciate your support. So thank you for 100 quick tips, gang. Peace.